Welcome to Introduction to Criminal Justice. In this brief slideshow, we'll be talking about Chapter 3, Crime and Crime Control. It's important that we try to define what a crime is. A crime is an act or omission in violation of a law punishable by a state. So an act would be something that you do, and an omission would be something that you fail to do. There are laws on federal and state level that require citizens to act in a certain way, and an omission would be a failure to act in that way. Without legislative action, crime would not exist and would not function to provide sanctions for specific behaviors. Little consensus about the seriousness of crimes would occur. It's important to draw a distinction between crime and deviance. Deviance is behavior that violates socially accepted standards of proper conduct. So some things we would never think would be acceptable in a social context. It doesn't necessarily make them illegal. And there are also other acts that could be illegal that's not necessarily deviant. Most crimes are defined by two components, and that's the actus reus and the mens rea. Actus reus is the action, and then mens rea means the intent. Corpus delicti refers to the body of the crime, basically all elements of the crime. Strict liability offenses presumes mens rea. In these cases, if the prosecution proves that the defendant engaged in the prohibited behavior, a conviction will occur. The offender is not responsible regardless of their intentions. So speeding and white-collar crime, I would say driving under the influence would be one of those. So we don't have to prove mens rea. In other words, someone doesn't need to set out to drive intoxicated. The mere fact that they were doing it, whether they meant to do it or not, means that they're going to be guilty in strict liability cases. It's important to draw a distinction between the classification of crimes. This is further described within your chapter as you read throughout the module. However, the categories are basically broken down by three levels. A felony is the most serious level of offense. Examples are grand larceny, murder, and robbery. And then a misdemeanor is the least serious offense. But a violation is also a least serious offense for crime. So it could very well be a parking ticket, any sort of citation. So something like that would not even be considered a misdemeanor. So you have felonies, you have misdemeanors, and then you have violations, which is the least serious. A misdemeanor is less, a violation is the least. Here you can see a slide on the defining of criminals. One common method of classifying offenders is by the crime they committed. If you committed murder, of course, you could be labeled a murderer, a rapist, or a burglar, and so on. First-time or ordinary versus repeat offenders or dangerous offenders. Typically, first-time offenders are going to be sentenced to much less of a fine or much less of a prison sentence than what a repeat offender would. Career criminals versus criminal careers. A career length would be the total length of time that an individual is involved in criminal behavior. Most people have a criminal career. So a criminal career would just be the time that you're most likely to commit an offense. Now that could very well just be that you speed or that you run stop signs, or when you first get your license, you engage in more actions that could be a violation of law. It could be that it's a violent career. It could be that it's based upon property crimes, but most people have that. Criminality is not always central to the personality of an offender. Life course criminality is how people engage in or refrain from the crime over the course of their lives. We know that most people who actively engage in crime of any kind are younger men, and most of the time when they age out of that criminal career is going to be around their mid-20s. Now that doesn't mean everyone that's in that certain range is going to commit crimes, but most people are. So we can examine that later on in this course when we're talking about putting people in prison for long periods of time. If your criminal career is likely between the ages of 19 and 23, and then you're convicted for a drug offense and sentenced to 30 years, the argument is that most of the time those people would not have continued to engage in that crime, even if they were not in the prison. So sometimes those lengthy prison sentences can cost taxpayers money when it's not necessary. A career criminal, however, is a bit different. These are the people who continue to commit crime over and over. A career criminal is someone for whom crime is a normal activity and for whom being a criminal is a part of self-identification. These people typically do not age out or have life course criminality that once they reach a certain age, the propensity to commit the crimes go down. Criminologists have begun to focus on the decision-making process of criminals. Why do those criminals commit crimes, and how do we as a society, or particularly as a criminal justice system, reduce those incentives? So rational choice theory treats criminals as economic decision makers who calculate the costs and benefits of crime before deciding to commit those crimes. Therefore, a rational choice theorist would say that if people had good jobs and if people had stable families, then they would not commit many of those crimes. Therefore, we should put our funds and our efforts into job creation and stable communities. A routine activity theory postulates that the crime occurs when a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian collide. In other words, a motivated offender would be someone who wants to commit the crime. A suitable target, how could we as a criminologist say, how should we reduce that suitable target? That could just be locking your doors. And the absence of a capable guardian collide, meaning that there's no one watching it. So basically, if you leave your door open and you have valuables in your house, routine activities would theorize that someone is eventually going to take them. All we need then would be a motivated offender. There are, of course, various ways to control crime and criminals. We'll be talking about that throughout this course. The 1970s saw an emergence of scholars that supported the belief that the most sensible approach to crime control required the identification of serious crimes. In other words, focus on those most serious crimes and most serious criminals. Rationing of criminal justice resources to maximize effectiveness and control repeat offenders. So this happened in the 70s when they're saying we're spending too much money locking up people, say, for possession of marijuana, when we should be focusing on locking up their most serious offenders. This has led to the creation of programs in criminal justice, which are distinguished by their duties. So we have law enforcement programs where they get out into the community, try to reduce crime, and then we have court programs, which could be diversion from court. Say a drug court could be an example of that. And then obviously we have our corrections programs where we have rehabilitation training inside of prisons, and the list goes on and on about all of these different ways that we can try to stop crime. So some of the law enforcement programs include identifying specific individuals as repeat offenders. You can read about these in your text. Operation Ceasefire in Boston targeted gang leaders for special enforcement. The goal was to reduce youth violence. Identifying high-risk areas where serious crimes are likely to occur and devote increased patrol to those areas, or what we call hotspot policing. Looking at an area, whether it be a street, a community, or a block, and then increasing our patrols in that area. Court programs, again, focus on those specialized units devoted to particular crimes. Project Safe Neighborhoods, an example of this type of program that has been executed at the national level. It focuses on criminal justice attention on firearms offenders. Evidence suggests that these programs result in a modest decline in violent crime. Other court programs being continued. Differential handling of career criminals at sentencing has long been a tradition in America. In other words, if we see that you are repeat offenders, you have done this, and we identify you as a career criminal, courts typically will hand down much more stringent punishments. You see selective incapacitation. To incapacitate means that you're not going to be able to be free. So selective incapacitation means people who commit crimes for a reason and are not career criminals, perhaps they're just inside their criminal career, may not necessarily need to be incapacitated for long periods of time. Reserves incarceration for those offenders who are most likely to commit future crimes. It's very difficult to predict, and one of the problems with that model is that sometimes biases, especially racial biases, can find their way into the jury or the court sentencing. And that's one of the problems with that. We cannot predict what people will do. Mandatory sentencing targets specific crimes and is really mandatory incarceration. Three strikes laws seek to identify serious repeat offenders and ensure that they receive sentences that result in long-term imprisonment. There's been a lot of problem with three strikes laws that you can read in your text, and it's not always worked. So sometimes having those three strikes laws means that somebody could commit a serious offense and then commit some very minor offenses later on and end up in prison for decades. Of course, the last one would be those corrections programs. Special intensive supervision programs have been created for probationers and parolees. Smaller caseloads enable the supervising probation or parole officer to have more contact with his or her clients each month. Officials classify offenders under community supervision by risk and need. This classification is most often made with assistance of a risk assessment tool. These tools evaluate offenders using a scoring method based on the presence or absence of several factors. These risk factors typically include criminal history, previous substance abuse, performance in work or school, and the presence of antisocial personalities. So basically, a probation officer in these corrections programs are going to give you a risk assessment, and they're not going to allow you to go free on probation or parole until we can lower those risk factors. The past 20 years have marked a significant increase in prison population, which some refer to as a policy of mass incarceration. And it's true, we seriously have too many people in prison in the United States, and it's costing taxpayers a lot of money. So the question is, should we continue to incarcerate, or should we allow people to go out on probation and parole and to try to rehabilitate those people? Are we better off with those people out paying taxes and working, or are we better off with those people being selectively incarcerated or incapacitated out of the way of society? A new direction for crime control, problem-oriented policing, is a method that employs the use of the SARA model to problem solve using a situational crime prevention approach. I want you to read about problem-oriented policing and all of its tenets within your textbook. It has been very effective and is widely accepted and often used in coordination with hotspot policing, and also to integrate criminal justice and community services. When we mean community service, we're talking about social services in Virginia, and there have been a lot of legislation lately that would fund having social workers and therapists who would actually ride with the police, or better yet, be employed by the police and be dispatched in lieu of a police officer. Sometimes a person showing up with a gun and a badge is not necessarily going to make the situation better, and those people would be specifically trained to handle those sorts of calls.